Hey everyone, this is Mark Treichel with another episode of With Flying Colors. The motivation for this podcast is a conversation that I had back at NCUA in 2008 or 2009 during the corporate credit union crisis. And something was said that always stuck with me, and it was the concept of $1 billion and how much it actually was. And I've been thinking about that a lot with things that are in the news, whether it's fraud with $1 billion or whether it's cost overruns at the Fed of for buildings of $2.5 billion. And then, of course, we have the politics that's going on between the Trump administration and the Federal Reserve. Been thinking a lot about that. I've got some visuals I've created that I'll be putting out on LinkedIn, linked to this podcast. And I put my thoughts together on the concept of this from a neutral perspective, because I am quite neutral on this. I can see both sides of it. And so with that, I'm going to dive right into this podcast, which I've called the 2.5, which am calling $2.5 billion egos and why big numbers need context. If you've been following the headlines, you've seen the latest clash between President Trump and Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. This time, it's over the Fed's building renovations and the now famous $2.5 billion price tag. Depending on which side you listen to, this is either reckless waste or total normal construction overruns being turned into a political weapon. My take, it's probably a little bit of both, or a lot of bit of both, because here's the truth nobody really wants to say out loud. Big government construction projects almost always cost more than they're planned to cost, and big political figures almost always want to put their fingerprints on the blueprints. That combination is not new, it's not unique to the Fed, and it's not unique to this administration. But when the number gets to 2.5 billion, it deserves real context, not just talking points. So let's do the math. Why we lose perspective on billions. Most of us can picture $1 million. $1 billion, not so much. So here are 3 ways to think about $2.5 billion. First, stacking dollar bills. This is the reference to what was said in the corporate crisis back in 08 and 09. A single $1 bill is about 4/1000ths of an inch thick, not thick at all. If you stacked 2.5 billion in $1 bills, that stack would be very high. How high? Actually, 170 miles high. I'm going to repeat that. $2.5 billion in $1 bills stacked, assuming they wouldn't get knocked over and assuming there was no wind, would be 170 miles high. That's not just above airplanes. That is well into space. So that's your first data point, a tower of cash reaching into orbit. Second, housing. Typical all-in construction costs for apartments today are roughly $300,000 to $500,000 per unit, depending on market and building type. At that range, $2.5 billion could build about 5,000 to 8,000 apartments. At just 2 people per unit, that's housing for 10,000 to 16,000 people. Yes, 10,000 to 16,000 people could be housed easily at a cost of $2.5 billion. That's not one building, that is multiple neighborhoods. Third, looking at time. If you spent $1,000 an hour, every hour, all day, every day, it would take about 285 years to spend $2.5 billion. Longer than the United States has been a country. So yes, we're talking about a lot of money. Why neither side is shocking on this topic. Now, I don't find it shocking that a major renovation of historic federal buildings costs far more than originally projected. Anyone who's ever remodeled a kitchen knows how that story goes. Now multiply that by asbestos, security requirements, historic preservation, and federal procurement rules. Costs go up, timelines slip, Scope changes, and that's the reference to everybody needs to influence the blueprint. That's part of this story. That part of this story is not unusual. What's also not unusual? Political egos wanting influence over major projects and political opponents using big numbers as leverage. That happens in agencies, that happens in Congress, that happens in state houses, and it happens in city halls. So I'm not shocked by the construction overruns, and I'm certainly not shocked by the politics. So why does the context still matter? Here's why it does. When numbers get this large, you can't just say that's how projects go because $2.5 billion is not a rounding error. It's not just another change order. It's a level of spending that has real opportunity costs, even if the spending itself is justified. And that's where public institutions owe the public something more than slogans. They owe clear explanations of scope, transparent cost drivers, and honest discussions of trade-offs, not just, it's complicated, trust us. Because of this scale, trust has to be earned with the math, even if you are the uber independent Federal Reserve. So the real risk is the power struggle. Where this gets risky is not in the drywall or the HVAC systems or the asbestos. It's the power struggles. When construction spending becomes part of a broader fight over who controls monetary policy, now you're mixing infrastructure disputes with institutional independence. That's not healthy for markets, it's not healthy for regulators, and it's not healthy for elected officials either. Once both sides start framing this as a test of authority instead of a debate over budgets and policy, everyone starts digging in, and when egos harden, solutions get harder. So here's my thoughts and where I land. I don't assume bad faith by the Fed just because costs went up, and I don't assume bad faith by politicians who question massive spending. Both things can be true at the same time. Big projects really do cost more than planned, and $2.5 billion still deserve serious scrutiny. And $2.5 billion still deserves serious scrutiny. What we don't need is theater. What we do need is context. Because once we understand the scale of the money, the conversation gets a lot more serious and a lot less performative. And when you're dealing with both public trust and financial markets, less performance and more transparency is usually the better path. As always, I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. This is Mark Treichel signing off with flying colors.